Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a historical journey right into the pressure cooker moments at the end of the Second World War. We're diving into those pivotal conferences of the big three: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill.
And specifically, that really sharp, painful transition from cooperation to conflict that you see between Yalta and Potsdam.
Exactly.
This deep dive is all about using your source material to get a handle on one of the most crucial topics in IGCSE history. It's all about understanding how a temporary military alliance, one built on pure necessity, just shattered.
Creating the fault lines of the Cold War.
Right. Our mission here is to move past the simple summaries you might read. We want to really unpack the details.
The environment in Yalta.
Yeah, and that shocking shift in leadership and technology that happened over the summer of 1945.
And how that led to the ideological breakdown at Potsdam.
We really need to pinpoint which agreements held, which promises failed almost immediately, and why the differences between these two summits are, well, the clearest possible illustration of the war's true political cost.
And that transition is what makes all this so fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
The historical context is just,
Mm-hmm.
it's everything. By early 1945, the victory over Nazi Germany was, for all intents and purposes, inevitable.
The outcome was no longer in doubt.
No. The Soviet forces were just grinding the German army down from the east, and the Western Allies had secured the West after D-Day. So the focus just abruptly shifts.
It's not about winning anymore.
No, it's entirely about dividing the spoils, structuring this new post-war world, and dealing with the immense, unprecedented challenge of rebuilding a totally devastated continent.
It's the ultimate political pivot, really. The fate of millions of people, borders, entire political systems. It all rested on the personalities and priorities of these three men. Meeting in the dying days of the war, to understand why it all went so wrong, we have to start when it was, relatively speaking, going right.
Okay, let's unpack that high point. We're starting in February 1945 in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula. And the sources all confirm this was arguably the moment where the cooperation between the big three was at its absolute strongest.
They were winning. The tide had turned so dramatically against Hitler since they last met in Tehran.
And that success, it seems, it bred this fragile sense of shared purpose.
It did, but crucially, it was all underpinned by these highly divergent personal dynamics. You had Franklin Roosevelt, who, despite his obviously declining health, kept this surprisingly optimistic, almost amicable relationship with Stalin.
He really seemed to believe in it.
He truly believed in collective security, and he felt he could manage Stalin as a partner in this new world. He saw him not just as an adversary, but as an ally whose needs, especially for security, had to be addressed.
And Stalin, for his part, seemed to play right into that optimism.
Especially with Roosevelt.
Yes, who was visibly in very poor health. Our source material notes that Stalin gave Roosevelt a genuinely warm welcome. And that famous toast he offered is such a key piece of political language, isn't it? It's almost a diplomatic promise.
I want to drink to our alliance that it should not lose its character.
I propose a toast to our alliance. May it be strong and stable.
It suggests, or at least it pretends to suggest, that the ideological differences could be put aside for, a long-term stable friendship.
But that perceived friendliness with Roosevelt was one thing. What really cemented Stalin's negotiating position was the sheer context of Soviet suffering.
Absolutely. And Roosevelt, perhaps more than Churchill, he acknowledged this trauma. That empathy definitely informed his diplomatic flexibility.
And we really cannot stress the scale of that destruction enough.
No.
Because it explains every single demand that Stalin subsequently made.
Every single...
The numbers are just, they're staggering. And you have to get your head around them to grasp why Stalin was so uncompromising on security.
We're talking about over 20 million Soviet citizens killed.
An astronomical figure, just unimaginable.
And then you layer on the infrastructure damage.
25 million people homeless.
7 million horses killed, which was vital for agriculture and transport.
And 65,000 kilometers of railway line just gone.
So if you imagine negotiating the future of Europe from that position of profound national trauma, your number one priority isn't going to be democracy in Poland. It's going to be absolute existential security and material recovery.
That's precisely why Roosevelt was even willing to support Stalin's initial claim for $10 billion in reparations.
A staggering financial demand at the time.
But it reflected the staggering and totally disproportionate sacrifice made by the Soviet Union.
And that willingness to acknowledge their need for recovery was absolutely key to the fragile unity at Yalta.
Okay, now let's contrast this diplomatic coziness between Roosevelt and Stalin with the ever-present skepticism of Winston Churchill.
Churchill was the realist in the room, the voice of, real politic. He was consistently pessimistic about Soviet communism and whether this alliance could work in the long term. He just viewed Stalin with this profound ideological distrust.
Even though he privately admitted, I like this man.
Right, but he saw the alliance purely as a temporary measure. It was a choice of the lesser of two evils.
For him, beating Hitler was the only thing that mattered.
Exactly. Everything else was negotiable, as long as it didn't fundamentally compromise the interests of the British Empire.
And you could see that difference in trust, can't you? Physically and diplomatically.
Oh, yeah.
The sources show that in the press photos, Roosevelt often puts himself between Stalin and Churchill.
Like he's the necessary bridge.
Yes.
Yes.
And Churchill communicated less.
Yeah.
He kept this cautious distance.
Arm's length caution. Lots of sarcasm.
Instead of Roosevelt's attempts at genuine friendship. So even at this high point of cooperation, the ideological rift was clearly there.
Just masked by the shared goal of defeating Germany.
But despite those underlying tensions, they did manage to reach some key agreements at Yalta.
They did. And they project this image of comprehensive, organized, global planning. These agreements really established the framework for the immediate post-war period.
Let's run through them. First, Germany's future. The agreement was crystal clear. Germany would be totally defeated and then split between the four major Allied powers, Britain, France, the USSR, and the USA.
That division was non-negotiable, and given what they were discovering about the concentration camps, they committed to denazification and genocide trials.
To ensure the Nazi regime would face justice.
Right.
Second big agreement, Japan.
Which was critical. The war in the Pacific was still brutal, and the US and UK were desperate to avoid a long, bloody ground invasion of the Japanese mainland.
So Stalin agrees that the USSR will join the war against Japan.
But only 3 months after Germany surrendered.
Which was a massive military concession. It potentially saved hundreds of thousands of Allied lives, and it showed Soviet willingness to cooperate beyond just Europe.
It did.
Third, and this is probably the most important promise that ultimately failed, self-determination.
The big one.
They agreed that all countries liberated from Nazi control, especially in Eastern Europe, were promised free elections to choose their own form of government.
This was the ideological ideal, the commitment to democracy championed by the West.
And finally, a huge agreement on global architecture.
The United Nations Organization, the UN.
All three leaders agreed to join, signaling this commitment to a new way of keeping global peace and security.
So on paper, Yalta presented this picture of unified action, division of Germany, war on Japan, democracy for liberated Europe, and a new mechanism for peace.
But that unity started to crack the second they turned to the single most contentious issue.
Poland.
Poland is the tragic centerpiece of Yalta, isn't it?
It really is.
For Britain, the invasion of Poland in 1939 was the whole reason they went to war. And yet here they are, at the moment of victory, negotiating away Polish territory. That required some immense political gymnastics.
It did. And you have to remember, Roosevelt and Churchill were operating in the shadow of Stalin's history.
Specifically, the 1939 pact with Hitler.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, yeah, which secretly sliced up Poland. They knew Stalin's capacity for betrayal, which makes the agreement they reached even more, well, shocking from a Western point of view.
So given that context, how did Stalin manage to convince them to effectively give up Eastern Poland? Why did they agree to what looked, politically, like a monumental compromise of principle?
Stalin's justification was brutally pragmatic, and it was historically resonant for Russia. He didn't deny the 1939 pact,
No.
but he framed the whole issue in terms of historical security. He was remarkably frank about it.
He just laid it out.
He argued that Poland had historically been the invasion corridor into Russia, by Napoleon in 1812, by Germany in World War I, and then by the Nazis in World War II.
He stressed emphatically that the Soviet Union just could not survive another invasion like that.
And therefore, he needed a territorial buffer state to ease those fears.
So he transforms the conflict from an ideological one, communism versus democracy,
Right.
into this fundamental clash between Soviet national security and Western political ideals.
And astonishingly, the West bought the security argument.
They did?
Roosevelt and Churchill conceded. They agreed to let the Soviet Union keep the eastern half of Poland. This was an enormous security concession.
And how did they justify it?
They justified it by believing that Stalin's need for material recovery and his participation in the UN would force him to stick to the political promise he made in return.
The promise of free and democratic elections in Poland.
Right, allowing the Poles to choose their own government.
So the compromise was concrete territory in exchange for a very vague political guarantee.
Exactly.
And we know that back in London, this was immediately seen as a huge political failure.
Oh, absolutely. When Churchill got back, he faced heavy criticism in Parliament. He was accused of selling out the Poles.
Of having bargained away
Yeah.
the very principle Britain went to war to defend.
And that intense domestic criticism really highlights the immense political difficulty of dealing with a powerful ally who, through military necessity, basically held all the cards on the ground.
And this concession on Poland leads directly to the big overarching strategic agreement.
The Soviet sphere of influence.
Right.
The sphere of influence concept is just central to understanding how the Cold War began. Because Stalin was so fixated on Eastern Europe as this critical invasion route, the Big Three formally agreed that the region would become a Soviet sphere of influence.
And what did that mean practically?
It meant that the USSR would have a dominant hand in shaping the internal politics of states like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary.
But wait, didn't that inherently contradict the promise of free elections they had just made?
It did.
If it's a Soviet sphere, how free can those elections actually be?
That is the core contradiction of Yalta. While the West later, vehemently criticized Stalin for violating the promise of self-determination, the sources are clear that at Yalta, they explicitly sanctioned the sphere of influence.
So what was the hope?
The hope was that Stalin would be moderate in his influence, that he'd allow for friendly but not necessarily communist governments.
But Stalin's interpretation was very different.
His interpretation was that a friendly government must be a communist government entirely aligned with Moscow.
And he started testing those boundaries immediately.
Right away in countries like Romania and Bulgaria, making it clear that free elections would only be acceptable if they returned communist-friendly results.
So Yalta really stands as the point where military necessity just completely overwhelmed ideological purity.
That's a great way to put it.
They got the agreements they needed to end the war and launch the UN, but the cost was accepting Stalin's fundamental security demands. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the geographic and political division of Europe.
If Yalta was about papering over the cracks, then the next 3 months just violently ripped all the plaster off. The speed with which the whole international situation changed between February and July 1945 is just astonishing. It dramatically increased the tensions that would come to define Potsdam.
Let's signal this transition really clearly for you. The entire landscape of global power shifted because of three major factors. First, and maybe the most obvious.
The common enemy was gone.
Right.
Yeah.
Germany formally surrendered in May 1945. That removed the single binding adhesive that held these fundamentally opposed ideologies together. Once Hitler was gone, the strategic alliance had no real reason to continue.
Second, the personal dynamic of the Big Three just evaporated.
On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died. And this was monumental.
It was. Roosevelt, for all his naivety, he understood Stalin and he believed he could manage that relationship. His successor, Harry S. Truman, was the absolute antithesis of Roosevelt.
In terms of diplomatic experience and ideological alignment,
Totally.
that personnel change needs a deep dive. Truman was a former senator with very little background in foreign policy.
And crucially, the sources show he was deeply anti-communist and immediately suspicious of Soviet actions in Eastern Europe.
He didn't share Roosevelt's personal touch at all.
Or his faith in collective security or managing Stalin. Truman came into the presidency with this massive deficit of trust. He viewed Stalin and Soviet expansion not through that empathetic lens of Soviet suffering, but through a Cold War lens of ideological aggression.
So when he prepared for Potsdam, he wasn't preparing to meet an ally.
No, he was preparing to meet an ideological rival who he felt was already breaking the promises made at Yalta, especially in Poland.
And that profound ideological gap set a completely different, much harder tone for the negotiations.
And then there's the third shift, arguably the most terrifying.
The technological one.
Right. Just as the Potsdam Conference was scheduled to begin, the United States acquired a weapon that redefined power.
The atomic bomb.
This is the atomic shadow. On July 16th, 1945, the Trinity test was successful in New Mexico. Truman gets the news while he's already in Potsdam, and the sources confirm he tells Stalin about this new weapon of unusual destructive force on July 17th. The implications are just staggering.
So how did the bomb affect Truman's attitude? Did it give him the confidence to take a harder line with Stalin?
Absolutely. Immediately. The bomb fundamentally altered the power dynamics.
Ah.
Before the test, the U.S. still saw Soviet entry into the war against Japan as essential to save American lives.
But after the test?
After the test, Truman knew he didn't need Stalin. This gave him immediate, tremendous leverage, confidence, maybe even a degree of arrogance.
Right.
He was able to reject Stalin's territorial demands in Japan later in the conference with absolute certainty, something Roosevelt might not have risked just 6 months earlier.
It's interesting. The sources note that Stalin showed very little visible surprise when he was told.
Which suggests he already knew through his espionage network. But regardless of his outward reaction, he understood the shift.
Of course.
The U.S. possessing the bomb meant that the military necessity that drove Yalta was completely over. The U.S. was now the uncontested global military power.
And Stalin must have realized his negotiating leverage had just dropped dramatically.
Which would only make him more entrenched on the issues he cared most about: security and reparations.
And the instability wasn't over. It continued right through the conference itself.
Yeah, midway through Potsdam, the British general election results come in.
And Clement Attlee replaces the monumental figure of Winston Churchill as prime minister.
It was just diplomatic whiplash. The result was that only Stalin remained from the original Big Three.
And the new leaders, Truman and Attlee, they had less history, less understanding.
And certainly more suspicion. They viewed Soviet actions in Eastern Europe not just as a defensive measure against past German attacks, but potentially as a defensive measure against possible future American attacks now that the U.S. had atomic superiority.
The stage was just set for a total breakdown.
The atmosphere at Potsdam was, well, it was fundamentally poisoned by distrust and political turnover.
Yeah.
And the absence of Roosevelt's personal touch meant that every single item was now negotiated through this zero-sum, hardline mentality.
And that change translated immediately into stark disagreements. Yalta had these sweeping, vague agreements. Potsdam had specific, stubborn conflicts.
Let's start with the immediate failure of the Yalta Promise. Poland.
They just failed utterly to agree on Poland's future. Despite the promise of free elections, Poland remained under the control of the Soviet-backed, communist-dominated government.
Truman saw this as Stalin breaking his word. Stalin saw it as him establishing the necessary security buffer that they had already agreed upon at Yalta.
The political rift was now irreparable.
It was, however, a major territorial agreement did come out of Potsdam, and it was a direct result of that previous Polish compromise.
They formalized the new Polish-German border.
Right. They set it at the Oder-Neisse line. This line shifted Poland's entire country westward, basically compensating it for the vast territory it had lost to the USSR in the east.
That seems like a small detail, but it had massive human costs, didn't it?
It was catastrophic. The Oder-Neisse line decision solidified the physical division of Central Europe, and it resulted in one of the largest forced population movements in modern history. Millions of ethnic Germans living in what was now Polish territory were systematically, and in many cases violently expelled westward into the Allied zones of Germany.
So this territorial solution created immense instability and a humanitarian crisis.
It did. It illustrates the immediate harsh consequences of these high-stakes diplomatic agreements.
But the single greatest conflict at Potsdam revolved around Germany's economic future, essentially determining whether Europe would be stable or just continue to struggle indefinitely.
Yes, and here Stalin's priority was clear: absolute security and massive economic recovery. He wanted to dismember Germany, prevent it from ever developing its industry again, and extract crippling reparations.
The figure would have been in the tens of billions of dollars, given the scale of Soviet destruction.
And the West Truman and Attlee had a diametrically opposed vision. They realized that a completely devastated Germany would be a drain on Western resources.
And a source of perpetual instability.
Right, potentially ripe for a communist takeover. They wanted to rebuild Germany. They saw a stable, industrialized Western Germany as the linchpin of a stable Western Europe.
Which led to a massive, direct confrontation.
The most specific flashpoint was the USSR's demand for access to Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr region.
Which was in the Western occupation zone.
Exactly. And the West rejected this request outright. This rejection was an absolute line in the sand.
A clear signal that the Soviet sphere of influence would not be allowed to extend into the most economically valuable parts of Western Europe.
Precisely.
So how did they resolve the reparations issue then?
Yeah.
Given the USSR's legitimate claim to recompense for its immense suffering?
They settled on a really messy, highly political compromise. Instead of demanding cash or access to the entire German economy, they agreed that each country would be allowed to take reparations only from its own occupation zone.
But the Soviet zone was mostly agricultural land. All the industry was in the West.
And they knew that. So, recognizing the overwhelming losses the Soviet Union faced, they allowed the USSR to take some industrial equipment from the Western zones.
But there was a catch.
A crucial caveat, only in return for providing food and raw materials from the Soviet zone.
Wait, if the Soviet Union had suffered such catastrophic destruction, why would the West require them to hand over food and raw materials, which they desperately needed, just to get some industrial equipment?
It was entirely calculated.
That seems like a calculated move.
The West saw this compromise as a way to regulate the flow of resources and, critically, to prevent the Soviet Union from simply stripping Western Germany of all its industrial capacity.
Which would have collapsed the German economy.
Entirely. The West wanted to maintain economic stability in their zones. This trade-off allowed the USSR to get some compensation while ensuring the Western zones retained enough industrial capacity to become self-sufficient and eventually a bulwark against the East.
And the final major disagreement was about Japan, where Truman's newfound leverage became really apparent.
Indeed. Despite the promise made at Yalta, when Stalin confirmed he was going to enter the war against Japan, Truman was now supremely confident.
Because of the bomb.
Right. Stalin still wanted territorial access or a secure foothold in Japan as a result of his military contribution. But Truman, not wanting to repeat the mistakes of Eastern Europe and the Pacific,
said no.
Rejected the request entirely. The need for Soviet military help had vanished, and so had Stalin's leverage in the Pacific.
So the disagreements were immense. They really defined the ideological split. And yet they still had to establish some kind of machinery to administer the defeated enemy.
They did.
What areas of continued necessary harmony did they manage to secure?
They agreed on 3 essential administrative points. First, Germany would still be governed by a joint body, the Allied Control Council, or ACC.
And its job was to administer Germany as a whole, including the four-sector occupation of Berlin.
Correct. But the ACC required unanimous decisions for any action.
And that unanimity rule sounds like a recipe for immediate paralysis, given the tension we've just described.
It was an immediate structural weakness. The requirement for unanimous decisions meant that as soon as the ideologies clashed, which they did immediately over reparations and political control, the ACC was rendered totally ineffective.
Right.
The failure of that unified governing body is what eventually led to the breakdown of four-power control, and it foreshadowed major crises like the Berlin blockade.
Second, they confirmed the commitment to justice.
Reiterating that Germany would be denazified and war crimes trials would be held.
A direct follow-up on Yalta, and a point of genuine moral agreement.
And third, recognizing how difficult these summits were, they established the Council of Foreign Ministers, the CFM. This was designed as a formal, ongoing body to deal with the treaties concerning the other defeated Axis powers going forward. It was a commitment to continued dialogue.
Even if that dialogue was now going to be conducted through veiled threats and deep suspicion?
The transition from Yalta to Potsdam is the history lesson here. It really is.
Yalta was defined by shared military objectives, personal trust, at least between Roosevelt and Stalin,
and vague, optimistic promises.
Whereas Potsdam was defined by deep suspicion, specific divisive territorial agreements, new leadership, and this intractable ideological conflict, especially over Germany's future.
The contrast is the clearest single illustration of the true starting point of the Cold War.
It's right there.
Yalta established the idea of the Soviet sphere. Potsdam confronted the harsh, undeniable reality of it.
And the key failure, from the Western point of view, was the total collapse of that promise of free elections in Eastern Europe.
By Potsdam, the Soviet armies, having liberated these nations, were now simply occupying them.
And setting up communist satellite governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria.
Right. And Truman and Attlee were furious that Stalin wasn't withdrawing his troops or permitting genuinely democratic elections.
And here we have to go back to Stalin's perspective from the sources. He was unwavering on this.
He insisted that the security of the Soviet Union was paramount, that Soviet control over Eastern Europe was a necessary defensive measure against invasion. He saw it as essential protection after suffering 20 million casualties.
He felt the West was just ignoring his need for security in favor of their own ideological purity.
It's the tragedy of two conflicting priorities, isn't it?
One nation's need for absolute security clashing head-on with another side's absolute need for political freedom.
And that conflict quickly became manifest in the political sphere. The West realized the extent of the betrayal of the Yalta spirit.
The immediate consequence being the political isolation and division of Europe, famously symbolized by Churchill's warning.
In March 1946, Churchill, now out of office, delivers that famous address in Missouri.
And he uses imagery that sticks forever, he says. A shadow has fallen upon the scenes, so lately lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended.
He was warning the world that the post-war vision of a democratic, peaceful Europe was already dead. He said communist parties were gaining control everywhere in the Soviet sphere, seeking totalitarian control.
For Churchill, this was the definitive moment confirming his lifelong pessimism about Soviet communism.
The Yalta concessions had come home to roost.
And Stalin's counter-argument to this speech, which is documented in the source material, is equally important because it shows the Soviet worldview.
Absolutely. Stalin responded by defending Soviet actions based entirely on the history of invasion. Finland, Poland, Romania, all the routes of attack they had suffered. He claimed anxiety that the Soviet Union's future safety was still being threatened by its former allies. He specifically referred to the Anglo-Saxons, who he claimed were trying to divide the world and impose their will through economic and military dominance.
A clear reference to the atomic bomb.
Without a doubt. He viewed the West's sudden concern for Eastern European democracy as simply a tool to undermine the security the USSR desperately needed and had paid for in blood.
So if we synthesize this comparison for you, the learner, the difference is crystal clear. Yalta was the agreement to cooperate, established by a military alliance.
And Potsdam was the moment that alliance disintegrated, where the unresolved conflicts over Poland and Germany were solidified by a massive, unavoidable shift in leadership and technology.
Transforming latent suspicion into open ideological warfare.
And the specific agreements made or broken, the vagueness of Polish elections, the concrete decision on the Oder-Neisse line, the paralysis of the ACC due to that unanimity rule, these are the details that show you how quickly political structures failed once the ideological gap was too wide to bridge.
The journey from Yalta to Potsdam is perhaps the most critical 5 months in post-war history. It shows how swiftly shared military necessity gave way to this entrenched ideological conflict. The decisions made in those two conferences, or maybe the compromises they failed to make at Potsdam, solidified the geopolitical division of Europe that would define the Cold War.
The contrast between the two is the textbook case of political misalignment overpowering military success. Yalta was about the fragile compromise needed to achieve victory.
Right.
Potsdam was about the bitter inability to compromise once victory was secured, and new power dynamics, particularly that atomic shadow, entered the room.
Which means for you, the learner, the key takeaway is that the seeds of division weren't planted in 1946 or 1947.
No.
They were planted at Yalta itself when concrete territory was exchanged for a very vague political promise.
And this raises a really important question that historians continue to debate, and one you should definitely mull over.
Okay.
Given the catastrophic devastation suffered by the Soviet Union, those 20 million deaths, the destroyed infrastructure, was Stalin's successful achievement of a Soviet sphere of influence always going to override the promise of free elections, regardless of who was sitting across the negotiating table?
Could any Western leader, even a healthier Roosevelt, have convinced Stalin to fundamentally sacrifice his nation's security buffer for the sake of democracy?
Or was the Cold War, in essence, unavoidable the moment the big three leaders left Yalta, having sanctioned the Soviet sphere?